When Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin held on to the arrogant belief that his special military operation would be over in a matter of days. It wasn't. After that, Putin thought the sheer size of Russia's military would be enough to do the job. It wasn't. And now Putin relies heavily on foreign partners to provide manpower, investment, and so much more. Russia has a big debt to pay these partners, and it's paying it in a way that Putin never expected. Russia's Far East is falling into Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un's hands, and there's nothing that Putin can do to stop it. At least that's according to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, which published an interesting article on October 16th, detailing the several ways that China and North Korea are slowly turning Russia's Far East into areas of foreign economic control. That article says that Putin has become so desperate to keep his war in Ukraine going that he's having to stretch too far to pay back the few allies that have continued to support Russia directly. Putin isn't just using money. Russia can't afford any more to pay for all that China and North Korea are doing for it. No, Putin is instead allegedly repaying these wartime allies with Russia's territory. Or as the Foreign Intelligence Service puts it, lacking the resources to develop the country's largest region, the Far Eastern Federal District, Moscow is opening the way for external expansion. This is essentially Putin saying to his allies that Russia can't develop these regions alone, so he wants their help to do it. The problem, which Putin doesn't appear to be able to see, is that encouraging this help only means that Russia is losing control of vast swathes of its territory. We'll start with China. A quick look at the Chinese investment into Russia's Far East is enough to see how China is digging its tendrils into this vast Russian region. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service says that Chinese investments into Russia's Far East are likely to reach 1 trillion rubles by the end of 2025. That amounts to $12.6 billion, which is all money that China is using to gain influence. Russia thinks that it's getting a good deal here, but China doesn't invest like this out of the goodness of its collective heart. Using its financial muscle to gain influence is a huge part of China's global geopolitical strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is a perfect example, and it also showcases how nefarious China can be with these seemingly benevolent investments. As The Guardian highlighted in May, China looks set to receive a windfall of $22 billion in loan repayments from the world's poorest 75 nations as part of its BRI scheme. China offers investments to these nations, allowing them to build infrastructure they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford. That investment has to be repaid, and that's all it takes. China has these typically poor nations on the hook for as long as it wants afterward. Either they repay or China exercises a greater level of control over those nations. It's a mobster-esque loan shark strategy. But it works, and China seems to be planting the seeds of that strategy in Russia's Far East. However, there's a catch. What China is doing in Russia's Far East doesn't seem to follow the typical BRI pattern. The investment is there, but the infrastructure projects that usually follow are nowhere to be seen. Instead, as Senator Viktor Kalashnikov from Russia's Khabarovsk region suggests, China is building its influence via trade. In Khabarovsk alone, Kalashnikov says the volume of trade between Russia and China increased by 5.5 million tons in 2024 alone. The first half of 2025 saw another substantial increase, as trade ballooned by another 36%. China is being clever here, knowing that Russia is unlikely to accept the sorts of unfair loans it typically offers via the BRI. China is instead making the Russian regions it wants to control dependent on China for trade. These upward trends aren't happening by accident. China is putting itself into a position where it has massive amounts of leverage in Khabarovsk. All it will have to do is threaten to pull the plug once that region is almost wholly dependent on China for trade, and Beijing will have the control that it seeks. Dagen adds that much of China's investment is also focused on resource extraction, which is a whole other problem for Russia. If China is taking Russian resources in the Far East, Putin is losing out on the money that those resources could generate. Russia's president has to repay his war debt somehow. This is how he's doing it, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service claims. However, the expansion of economic influence isn't all that China is doing to subtly shift control of Russia's Far East out of Putin's hands. In a country that has a population of over 1.4 billion, people are a commodity. And China is using this commodity to great effect against Russia, as it's slowly been implementing what Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service calls a creeping demographic change in Russia's Far East. According to the report, China has managed to send up to 2 million of its citizens to live and work in the region between the Ural Mountains and Vladivostok. This is all by design, with Putin approving everything. Most of the Chinese nationals arriving in these regions work under visa-free agreements and are operating inside Special Economic Zones, or SEZs, in Russia's Far East. SEZs are interesting for a simple reason. They are areas within a country that operate under different business and trade regulations from the rest of the country. In Russia's case, this appears to mean that China is setting up SEZs where trade and business rules are Chinese rather than Russian in Russia's Far East. Again, it's all about control, and these SEZs see that control slipping out of Putin's hands. The fact that China's immigrant workers are also being allowed to operate without visas lends more support to the argument that the SEZs China now occupies essentially no longer belong to Russia. Presumably, Russia has some sort of agreement in place where it can strip the regions China is populating of their SEZ status if it needs to do so. However, Putin would be loath to exercise that sort of power. If he's paying for Chinese support using land in Russia's Far East, that support disappears as soon as he tries to take that land back. Russia may never be able to reclaim these SEZs. And if it tries, it faces the tricky task of expelling around 2 million Chinese nationals from its territory without angering President Xi. Earning the ire of China is the last thing that Putin wants to do right now. After all, as Reuters reported on September 25th, Chinese engineers are working alongside sanctioned Russian drone manufacturers to help them tweak and perfect their products. Putin needs these drones. In 2025, Russia's aerial strategy has evolved a massive escalation in drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, with reportedly every month since May witnessing the launch of at least 4,000 and up to 6,297 drones targeting Ukraine. That's according to the Institute for Science and International Security, which also notes that there hasn't been a month in 2025 since Russia has launched fewer than 2,000 drones at Ukraine. It seems that Russia is building those drones with China's help. That's yet another piece of leverage Xi holds over Putin. Try to stop China's creeping demographic and economic expansion into the Far East now, and those drone engineers aren't likely to stay. So it's clear how China is slowly grabbing territory in China's Far East. But what about North Korea? According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, Russia's big mistake here is welcoming scores of workers from North Korea into its Far East. Officially, the service says around 15,000 North Koreans have arrived in that region over the past year alone. Unofficially, the number may be as high as 50,000. The BBC also shares the 50,000 number in an August article in which it reports that the North Korean laborers being sent to work in Russia are operating in what it calls slave-like conditions. The outlet interviewed 6 workers who had managed to escape these conditions, with one worker, named Chan, detailing some truly horrifying conditions. Some people would leave their post to sleep in the day or fall asleep standing up, but the supervisors would find them and beat them. It was truly like we were dying, Chan told the BBC. The workers often worked late into the night with no lights or safety equipment, and another escapee says that he worked on a high-rise apartment block for 18 hours per day while in Russia. To Putin, this is all near-slave labor that is cheap, effective, and comes from an ally. To North Korea, it's a chance to build influence and develop a presence in Russia's Far East. Of course, North Korea isn't as capable as China when it comes to exerting economic holds over Russian territory. But with Russia clearly needing manpower to develop its Far East region, North Korea seems to be following China's blueprint when it comes to using its own people to gain leverage over Putin. North Korea is already getting plenty out of this arrangement. Note that we said North Korea and not North Korean workers. Those workers are receiving the bare minimum wages possible, while Kim Jong-un pockets $500 million per year from Russia, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service claims. Plus, Russian companies have already ordered another 153,000 contracts for North Korean laborers, the service reports. Even if we assume that $500 million per year is for the unofficial 50,000 workers in Russia's Far East, that still amounts to $1.5 billion annually. But if the $500 million figure refers to the official count of 10,000 workers, then around 150,000 more means another $7.5 billion Russia has to find. Does Putin have that sort of money to spend on labor, given how much the Ukraine war is costing Russia? Perhaps not. And if he doesn't, North Korea may be in a position to use these worker contracts to conduct its own territory grabs in Russia's Far East. Russia seems to be oblivious to what's happening here, at least officially. In July, Korea Jungang Daily carried a story in which it said that Russia's lawmakers are endorsing their new North Korea workers as being more reliable than Russia's existing migrant workforce. They would be, given that they work under constant supervision and face the threat of punishment if they can't handle grueling 18-hour days. If these workers are more reliable, then Russia will rely on them even more. 153,000 new contracts makes a lot more sense in that context. And Putin either doesn't see or doesn't care about the impact this will have on Russia's Far East in the future. Russia's playing a very dangerous game here. The risks involved are massive. As Dargan points out, China and North Korea are each building leverage in different ways. Combining monetary muscle and sheer manpower, China is building influence in Russia's Far East, by creating economic dependency. North Korea is creating a separate dependency, this time on cheap labor. It's possible the two countries could end up colliding as their attempts to grab territory overlap, Dagan says. But even in that situation, Russia will be an ineffective mediator in conflicts over territory that Russia is supposed to control. It all adds up to a major problem for Russia, as Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service notes. The Kremlin risks losing control over 40% of its own territory, almost 7 million square kilometers with a population of 7.9 million, turning the Far East into an area of foreign strategies, the service says in conclusion to its report. That's a huge chunk of territory to risk to ensure continued Ukraine war support, and it could lead to Putin facing the ultimate irony. Expanding Russia to the west might lead to Russia losing far more in the east. Far from an age of expansion, Russia may be entering an age of contraction. At least that's according to author and investing expert Daniel Peris. Writing for Engelberg Ideas, Peris notes that Russia's demographic crisis is playing a part in what's happening in the country's Far East. The normal population replacement rate is 2.1 births per female for Russia. The total fertility rate is currently just 1.4, Peris says. That means that the population, currently around 145 million, is on its way to a forecast 136 million by mid-century. Perhaps it's this declining population, which is only being accelerated by the many casualties Russia has experienced in the war, that is making Putin so desperate for investment and labor. And at the very least, it's a contributing factor, as it adds a second shade to the unpretty painting Putin is creating. He's already allowed China and North Korea to place themselves in positions to grab Russian territory based on his single-minded focus on Ukraine. But even after the war ends, Putin will still need these two nations to offer as much as they are willing to solve the Russian demographic crisis. The influence runs deeper. Russia loses ground as a result. What we see here are the results of a series of mistakes Putin has made, starting with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. The New Eurasian Strategies Center says that Putin declared what Russia called its pivot to the east, a national priority for the 21st century in 2013, though it was forced to accelerate this pivot following its actions in Crimea. With the collective West coming down on Russia with sanctions and similar punishments, which have only gotten worse since Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia's strategy was to reduce exposure to Western pressure by turning east as a counterbalance. At the time, this great pivot was all about securing access to new markets and developing a geopolitical foothold for Russia in the Asia-Pacific, the center says. But in reality, the pivot simply saw Russia switch its economic dependence on the West into an economic dependence on the likes of China and India. Those countries, which saw Russia as partners that were on its level, have instead been taking advantage of Russia's growing weakness since it invaded Ukraine. We see that in Russia's oil sales. Hit by price caps and sanctions, Russia turned to China and India to sell its oil. Both have enjoyed heavy discounts, with China alone having saved $10 billion in 2022 and 2023 by buying Russian oil. Putin sees this as a necessary monetary sacrifice to make to keep some cash flowing into Russia as the war rages on. China, India, and other buyers all see it as a way to both gain leverage and enrich themselves at Russia's expense. The point we're making here is that Putin understands how important the East is, both in terms of Russia's Far East and Asia as a whole. But what he's failed to do, time and time again, is establish Russia as a dominant geopolitical force in eastern regions. Now, Russia is dealing with the reverse of what it intended to happen with its pivot to the East. Russia was supposed to be the country gaining influence inside other nations. Instead, it's the likes of China and North Korea that are doing that to Russia. And again, this is all by Putin's mistaken design. In September, the Carnegie Endowment published an article in which it pointed out that Russia has placed almost all of its eggs in the Chinese basket. In doing so, the organization claims, Putin has only deepened what it calls Russia's vassalage to China. In other words, Putin is willingly making his country at least somewhat subservient to China, also that he can get what he wants in Ukraine. Russia's isolation from the West was entirely Putin's decision, and it's now coming back to hurt Russia. As Russia's estrangement from the West deepens, China's role as a lifeline to Putin's system is only set to grow, and there is no escape now, the Carnegie Endowment claims. When Putin turned his back on the West a decade ago, he had China to fill the void. But now, even if for some reason he chose to pivot away from Beijing, there is no credible alternative. That, in a nutshell, is where Putin's Far East problem lies. Russia could still hold some sway over North Korea, at least until it becomes totally dependent on the country for cheap labor that fills the void left by Russia's demographic issues and the loss of so many of the country's young men in Ukraine. But China is in a far greater position of power. Let's say Putin decides to reject all of China's investment, its 2 million people, and the SEZs being created in Russia's Far East. Where does he go next? The West isn't going to offer Russia a lifeline, at least not without Putin making major concessions in Ukraine. The refusal to make those concessions is what got Russia into this position to begin with, so that's not going to happen. There simply aren't any other nations with the sheer economic might of China that could keep Russia going. At least no other nations with which Putin hasn't thoroughly burned Russia's bridges. Xi has played Putin so well here that Russia is left with no other recourse. North Korea, almost like a vulture, is now taking advantage of Putin's weakness in Russia's Far East too. Does this mean that Russia will lose up to 40% of its Far East territory that Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service claims to be at risk? It looks increasingly likely. As we speak, China is supposedly providing 80% of the critical parts Putin needs for his drone war, United 24 Media reported on October 15th. Russia is going to need those parts, along with the engineers, the investment, and the labor, for a long time to come, given that Russia's 2025 gains in Ukraine amount to 1% of the country's territory. Now, Russia occupies around 20% of Ukraine. It's taken over 3.5 years for Russia to get that far. With another 80% of Ukraine to go before Putin can declare victory, Russia would require decades' worth of help from its foreign allies that are even now using Russia's position to gain influence in the Russian Far East. It's just as the Carnegie Endowment says, there's no escape for Russia. Putin is reaping what he has sown, though he may be long gone by the time the full impact of the sacrifices he's made to support his Ukraine invasion is known. Russia just can't seem to pull off a mechanized assault right now. It's been trying. After a summer spent trying to infiltrate small groups of troops into the vital logistical city of Pokrovsk, Russia has reverted to type and is attempting to send its armor to batter Ukraine's defenses, but Ukraine always sees it coming. And the result is more Russian tanks and armored vehicles burning on the battlefield. That's precisely what happened in the Dobropillia direction on October 16th. Ukraine set the perfect trap. A Russian battalion walked straight into a hell from which there was no escape. United 24 Media reports that the Russian military has just tried and failed to launch a mechanized attack on the Dobropillia region. The attack was designed to take the small settlement of Shakhove, which has been a target for Putin throughout much of October. In fact, this latest mechanized assault followed another in which Russia finally unleashed some of the T-90M battle tanks it had in storage, only to see those tanks obliterated in an instant. Check out our video if you'd like to learn more about that failed assault. This time around, Russia thought it was going to learn from its mistakes. It intended to take Shakhove, with that settlement then to serve as a launching pad into Dobropillia, which would itself enable an assault on Pokrovsk. The problem is the same one that Russia has faced with all of its mechanized assaults in recent memory. Ukraine was ready, and Russia's tanks and armored vehicles were obliterated. The news of the failed Russian assault comes from the infamous Azov National Guard, which Ukraine deployed to the Pokrovsk region in August to help counter a series of settlement snatches conducted by the Russian occupying forces. Since August, Azov has been working both to take territory back and to protect settlements that Putin's forces are trying to claim. On October 16th, the Azov National Guard succeeded again, and it took to Telegram to describe what had happened. Between 5:30 and 8 in the morning, the enemy launched an attack with 22 units of armored vehicles. The largest column, 11 units, tanks and armored combat vehicles, left the area of the settlement of Malinivka at about 7:50, the Azov National Guard reported. The sheer size of this armored battalion shows that Russia was taking the assault on Shakhove seriously. This was no small poke at Ukraine's defenses to see how they would react. Russia would likely have spent several weeks amassing enough tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, or IFVs, to conduct this assault. It was also organized. The mention of the largest column suggests that Russia had split its armor, perhaps with the intent to attack Shakhove from multiple directions. If Russia has been allowed to approach the settlement without any barriers being put in the way, it may well have succeeded in taking Shakhove. The Azov National Guard ended up being the only barrier that Ukraine needed, but it had to overcome a few hurdles before it could properly mount its defense. Russia came prepared, it seems. The country had clearly learned from its tank fiasco just a few days prior. The enemy began preparations for the assault in advance, the Azov National Guard says. In order to complicate the mining of the advance routes, the enemy set up observation posts to detect and destroy drones of the defense forces of Ukraine. This is smart by Russia. One of Ukraine's main defenses in the Pokrovsk region has been to set up drones that patrol roads and any other possible points of incursion that Russia can use to launch its assaults. Russia didn't go into the October 16th assault unprepared. For once, it sent units to figure out where these drones were operating, rather than simply sending soldiers to get destroyed by those drones as a means of conducting reconnaissance. Russia also tried to change how it conducts mechanized assaults. Previously, the Azov National Guard says Russia would launch its mechanized assaults from deep within its own battle formations, which created an obvious problem. Having to travel further means that these assaults were exposed to Ukraine's drones and mines for longer. Time wouldn't be on the Russian forces' side. as Ukraine could use these long journeys to ruin Russia's chances before its assaults even began. This time, Russia planned to use October 15th to slowly advance its mechanized units to the outskirts of Shakhove, using trees and forested areas to provide cover from Ukraine's ever-present drone eyes in the skies. Again, it's a smart strategy, at least when compared to Russia's other assaults. The plan was for Russia to close the distance first, without alerting Ukraine, so that it could then launch its assault immediately rather than having to travel to do so. However, Russia's strategy failed. The Azov National Guard cottoned on to what it was doing in time. The maneuver was unsuccessful. 2 units of armored vehicles were detected by reconnaissance and destroyed by artillery and FPV drones of the unmanned systems forces before they even tried to hide in the forest, the Azov National Guard reports. The FPV drones must have acted as the first wave of Ukraine's defense, as October 16th saw Ukraine go from attacking Russia's incoming units to taking them out altogether. The Azov National Guard says that a combination of effective mining, likely laid on the routes Ukraine predicted Russia would try to take once it had discovered the armor, and advanced engineering equipment placed in the right positions stopped the Russian assault in its tracks. This is where Ukraine's artillery must have come into play. As FPV drones laid waste to Russia's armor directly, Ukraine's artillery fired on the enemy positions to ensure Russia's tanks and IFVs couldn't get anywhere near Shakhove. Russia attempted to use Ukrainian forests to hide its advance. Those same forests ended up serving as Ukraine's trap, and Russia paid a heavy price. By the end of Ukraine's counterattacks, 9 of Russia's tanks and IFVs had been completely destroyed. Another 4 were damaged, and that often means they'll be taken out of commission sooner rather than later. Russia's forces have a long history of abandoning their vehicles at the slightest hint of trouble. They were doing it as early as March 1, 2022, and they've been doing it ever since. It makes more sense to get out of a damaged vehicle and run into cover than it does to stay in that vehicle. Would you rather be in a large and barely mobile target when Ukraine's drones are hunting you down, or would you prefer to attempt an escape on foot while making yourself a much smaller target? That's the choice Russian soldiers face when their armor is damaged. And more often than not, making the choice to run on foot leads to damaged armor being claimed by Ukraine. It wasn't just Shakhove that Russia hoped to take on October 16th either. Another small settlement named Volodymyrivka was also in Russia's sight, with the Azov National Guard's counterattack also being coordinated to ensure the settlement was defended. In fact, it's from the direction of this second settlement that we get our proof of what the Azov National Guard and the Ukrainian units alongside which it is working managed to pull off on October 16th. That proof comes from the Sun's YouTube channel, which has published footage of Ukraine's counterstrike. It says that the 82nd Air Assault Brigade played a big role in both setting and closing the trap on Russia's forces, with most of the footage likely coming from FPV and reconnaissance drones that the brigade brought to the battlefield. The footage shows Russia's tanks and IFVs as they attempt their approaches. Early on, we see the view being captured by one of Ukraine's FPV drones as it shadows a Russian armored vehicle. After a few seconds, that drone veers to the left and attacks, scoring a direct hit on the vehicle's tracks. Much of the footage follows a similar pattern. A drone gets one of Russia's tanks or IFVs in its sights. Within seconds of spotting the threat, the drone speeds up and scores a direct hit. Of course, these FPV drones are launching kamikaze attacks, which means the footage they're capturing cuts out the second they score a hit. Russia might try to use that fact to claim that Ukraine wasn't as effective as it was on October 16th. The Azov National Guard and its compatriots are more than aware of that fact, which is why they had reconnaissance drones circling around Russia's armor to capture more footage of everything that happened. Flaming wreckage is seen on the roads and in the Ukrainian tree lines. The message being sent to Putin is clear. This is what happens to Russian armor in Dobropillia. Send more if you dare. Whether Russia will or not remains to be seen. The odds are that more mechanized assaults are going to come because of how desperate Putin is to capture Pokrovsk. Russia appears to see Dobropillia as its route into that vital city, so what Ukraine achieved on October 16th likely serves as a portent of things to come in the Shakhove and Volodymyrivka directions. Russia has already tried to assault Shakhove twice in a week. It's failed to even get close to the settlement both times. All of this leads us to what this successful Ukrainian strike against Russia's mechanized forces means for the future of the Dobropillia region and the war in general. One thing is for certain, things aren't going well for Russia in the Dobropillia direction. RBC Ukraine makes that clear in its report on Ukraine's October 16th attack by providing more details about another assault Russia launched on October 13th. All told, Russia lost 16 heavy armored vehicles on October 13th, including BMP and MTB-LB armor, along with its tanks. Add those to the 9 pieces of armor that Russia lost 3 days later, and you get a very productive week for Ukraine's Dobropillia defenders. They've taken out 25 armored vehicles and tanks in total, which takes a significant bite out of the armor Russia hoped to use to both take Shakhove and launch any future assaults on Dobropillia. In a separate October 13th report, RBC Ukraine reveals that Russia lost 78 soldiers during this assault. We don't know how many of the country's soldiers were killed on October 16th. The Azov National Guard didn't reveal that information, likely because it's still tallying up the numbers to figure out how many Russian troops escaped versus how many died inside their armor. However, the 78 casualties in the October 13th assault are already a heavy toll, and it is indicative of a Dobropillia campaign that is really hurting Russia from a manpower perspective. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke about Russia's lack of success in the Dobropillia direction in a Facebook reel, discussing what has been happening in the direction. In just our Dobropillia counteroffensive operation, Russian overall losses have already exceeded 3,000, most of them irrecoverable, Zelensky says. This was the area where the Russians aimed to achieve one of the major breakthroughs on the front, but our forces are neutralizing them. There are a couple of important points here. First, it's clear that Russia has been pushing to take Dobropillia for a long time before its October 16th failure. Losing 3,000 troops to this relatively small city is already embarrassing enough, especially as Russia hasn't even managed to get close to Dobropillia yet. However, it also shows us just how little regard Putin has for the soldiers that he's sending into these types of assaults. Russia has at least attempted to avoid launching a head-on attack on October 16th, though that failed. In other assaults, its forces have basically launched themselves straight into Ukraine's defenses, making it easy for Ukraine to rack up the Russian casualties. Second, Zelensky mentions that most of the 3,000 casualties were irrecoverable. Ukraine's president is touching on an interesting trend we're now seeing in the Ukraine war. On October 13th, Politico reported that Russia has a terrible ratio of killed to wounded soldiers. Right now, that ratio amounts to 1.3 soldiers wounded for every one that dies in Ukraine. That's a dreadful ratio. In today's wars, a country should see multiple wounded for every death due to the impact of modern medicine and more stringent evacuation protocols. Russia, it seems, is happy to leave its wounded to fend for themselves, and many are dying as a result. When it comes to the 3,000 casualties in Dobropillia, this ratio would mean that well over 1,000 of those casualties are deaths. That's a major problem for Russia. It means that future assaults are either going to be weak due to the scale of the death or delayed while Russia tries to replace its soldiers with reserves. Remember that all of this is just in the Dobropillia direction, and Dobropillia isn't even Putin's main target. Russia is launching so many attempted assaults on the settlements around Dobropillia because it's trying to get closer to Pokrovsk. Of course, this also means that every failure in Dobropillia means that Putin will have to wait longer to capture Pokrovsk, assuming Russia ever captures it at all. Putin will feel that he's waited long enough. In the summer, Russia launched a massive offensive in the Pokrovsk direction that was intended to lead to the fall of the city by August. Putin dedicated 110,000 troops to the cause and embarked on a multi-month series of assaults that did succeed in taking some territory close to Pokrovsk. Ukraine countered and took back many of the most important settlements that Russia had briefly occupied. But the point here is that Russia is no closer to getting its hands on Pokrovsk than it was when it launched the offensive that was supposed to cripple Ukraine's defense of the city by the end of August. And Putin needs Pokrovsk to fall. If it doesn't, Russia will really struggle to claim all of Donetsk. Since the war began, Pokrovsk has been one of Ukraine's most important strongholds on the Donetsk front. It's not just that Pokrovsk is an important city from a size perspective. It's also in the perfect geographic location to serve as a logistical hub that Ukraine can use to supply all of its forces in Donetsk, Euronews reports. Putin wants Pokrovsk to both cut off this major logistical artery and to use Pokrovsk as a hub for his own troops. It also helps that Pokrovsk is only 12.4 miles away from the Donetsk administrative border, which you could think of as the finishing line for Russia's entire Donetsk campaign. If Putin's forces reach that border, Donetsk is essentially under Russian control. Pokrovsk is a major barrier preventing that from happening, and with Russia's forces failing so hard in Dobropillia, it seems unlikely that Russia is going to be taking Pokrovsk anytime soon. Do you remember the 110,000 soldiers Putin has dedicated to Pokrovsk? Failed assaults like the one seen against Dobropillia on October 16th are putting a serious dent in those numbers. On October 16th, David Axe, writing for Euromaidan Press, reported that leaked Russian documents have revealed that Russia is suffering 35,000 casualties per month in 2025. Of course, not all of those casualties are in the Pokrovsk direction. However, Axe says, Russia's determination to take Pokrovsk has led to its losses growing by between 18 and 20%. In other words, Russia's monthly casualty average would be lower than 35,000 were it not for the amount of soldiers that it's feeding into the Pokrovsk meat grinder right now. Speaking about meat assaults, Russia at least attempted to prevent October 16th from being yet another one of them. It failed, but it tried. Other units haven't been so successful, as we discovered on September 22nd. That's when United 24 media reported that Russian troops have been exposing their commanders for throwing them into meat assaults from which there is almost no escape. Those assaults, which are happening daily around Pokrovsk, essentially involve Russian commanders ordering their forces to attack regardless of whether those forces are ready to launch an assault or not. One Russian soldier has even documented the outcome of one of these meat assaults in a Telegram post, where he recorded the bodies of several of his fallen comrades. Ukraine's Air Force commented on the post, stating, "This is yet another example of the Russian command's disregard for the lives of its soldiers. They are promised big contract payments and humane treatment, but instead receive nothing and are immediately sent into battle, without equipment, without support, without assistance, straight into meat assaults." These meat assaults aren't working in Pokrovsk, Dobropillia, or anywhere else in the Donetsk region, and Russia's pace of advance proves it. On October 16th, Newsweek reported that the UK Ministry of Defence has revealed that Russia's pace of advance halved in September when compared to August. That halving follows a 3-month pattern of decreases that started in June, which was the height of Russia's summer offensive. What this means is that Putin is sacrificing more soldiers than at any other point in 2025, and he's gaining less ground in return for that sacrifice. October 16th, though not a meat assault in the truest sense of the word, still stands as a testament to how ineffectual Russia's attacks have become. Ukraine often sees them coming from a mile away, especially when mechanized units are involved, and Russia's soldiers are dying in huge numbers in Dobropillia and elsewhere in Pokrovsk as a result. We mentioned mechanized units just now. Another 9 were taken out of commission, potentially going up to 13 thanks to Ukraine's October 16th trap. Russia won't want to see that because it's already struggling mightily to launch these kinds of assaults after almost 4 years of attritional warfare have burned through its tank and armored vehicle stockpiles. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance reports that Russia has lost 11,261 tanks and 23,384 armored vehicles between the beginning of Putin's invasion and October 16th. That's a total of 34,645 pieces of armor gone. And Russia is running out of mechanized units that it can send to assaults like the one in Dobropillia. These kinds of assaults have to work for Russia. When its tanks and vehicles are being taken out before they even have a chance to attack, it only makes a bad problem worse. As far back as February, the International Institute for Strategic Studies was reporting that Russia was on track to run out of tanks by 2026, per Newsweek. Incidents like the October 16th failure aren't going to help Russia remedy that problem, and we're really starting to see how bad Russia's armor situation is right now. On October 7th, United 24 media reported that satellite analysis of Russian tank storage bases has revealed that Russia has gone from having 7,342 usable tanks in storage to just 92. It has many other tanks, but they are in various states of disrepair, with many only being useful to provide components for other tanks that aren't quite so decrepit. If these sorts of trends continue, 2026 is going to be a rough year for Russia's ground assaults. But even when it has armor to deploy, Ukraine proved on October 16th that it's more than up to the task of handling it.
It's amazing what two countries can do when they team up to tackle a problem. That's what Ukraine and the US have been doing recently, as Ukraine's drone developers have been working with an American company to come up with an unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, that will deliver hell to Russia. That UAV is now ready to go, and that means Ukraine has done something few would have believed for the US military. It's helped the most advanced military in the world catch up in the one area where it was really falling behind. America's drone game just got supercharged, and it's all thanks to Ukraine. On October 16, United 24 media reported that a new AI-powered drone named Artemis has been tested and is now approved to enter mass production. The drone was being developed by Ukraine alongside a US defense drone software and artificial intelligence company named BATTALION. Together, Ukraine and the US had a clear plan: develop a long-range strike drone that's modeled on every lesson that Ukraine has learned during its war with Russia. Artemis is the result, and this UAV looks like it's going to be a game changer. That reason will be explored in a moment. First, BATTALION itself has announced that the drone is ready to go in a press release that offers a few more details about what the US and Ukraine have just achieved. BATTALION is partnered for the Artemis program with a Ukrainian hardware manufacturer whose name is being kept confidential for operational security reasons, the company says. Keeping the Ukrainian manufacturer private is a good move. Ukraine has been expanding its drone manufacturing base for a while, and it naturally wants to offer as little information as possible to Russia. If Vladimir Putin's forces picked up on a name, that would give the country's intelligence services some clues that could lead them to where the Ukrainian manufacturer behind Artemis is based. A strike on that manufacturer could have ended the Artemis project. So secrecy was of the utmost importance. Auterion adds that the new drone has gone through an extensive range of tests that include conducting a ground launch and navigating toward a target with the assistance of GPS. Tests have also been carried out to ensure that the drone can still fly toward a target in a GPS-denied environment. Plus, the obvious test of ensuring carrying capacity, flight length, and the ability to conduct terminal engagement have all been completed. Now, Auterion says, the testing phase is completed and the drone is preparing to enter mass production. With the Artemis program concluded, Auterion is entering the scale-up phase with the Department of War to work towards co-production at mass scale, Auterion states. The company is committed to supporting domestic US production while delivering a common software layer that ensures interoperability and continuous improvement. Pay attention to that last sentence because it's very important. Auterion is saying that this isn't any old drone that it's developed alongside Ukraine. It's a drone that's supported by a common software layer that will be used by every country that operates the Artemis. In other words, Ukraine won't be the only country that gets its hands on this new drone. The US is going to be building plenty for itself, and it's going to be able to improve on an already impressive drone over time thanks to its cooperation with Ukraine. The importance of this type of statement can't be denied. It was only in March that the relationship between Ukraine and the US had become so contentious that the US suspended all military aid to Ukraine. Back then, the level of cooperation that led to the creation of the Artemis drone would have seemed impossible. Ukraine was instead facing a future where it would have to fight against Russia without its most powerful ally by its side. Fast forward to October, and the US isn't just helping Ukraine again, it's working alongside Ukraine to develop the precise types of weapons that will do as much damage to Russia as possible. And that leads back to the Artemis drone and what it actually brings to the table for Ukraine and eventually the US. The basic specifications make the new drone seem similar to pretty much any other long-range drone the Ukraine has in its arsenal. The Artemis has a combat-proven range of 1,000 miles and it can carry an 88-pound warhead, United 24 media reports. That's not too far away from the specifications of Ukraine's own Lyuty drone, which has been around since 2024 and has been used in Ukraine's recent long-range assaults against Russia's oil refining sector. The Lyuty has a stated range of over 620 miles and can carry a warhead weighing up to 110 pounds. Militani reported in April 2024. However, on October 3rd, the same outlet reported that a Lyuty drone had been spotted flying 869 miles deep inside Russia, with some outlets suggesting a distance closer to about 932 miles, which brings its range closer to the new Artemis. So, what's the big deal about Artemis? Ukraine already has drones that can fly comparable distances and carry even heavier warheads. The big deal isn't the drone itself, but rather the software that's used to power the drone. That's where Auterion comes into play, and the company has developed a package that may make the Artemis one of, if not the most dangerous drones in Ukraine's arsenal. That software is the Auterion Visual Navigation System, and it works thanks to the Skynode N mission computer that Auterion has developed as part of this joint project. Using that system, the Artemis is capable of navigating to and conducting a strike against a target even when the satellite navigation system it uses has been disrupted by Russia's jamming techniques. The drone also has built-in terminal guidance, which Auterion claims offers it pinpoint accuracy during the final stage of its flight. It's thanks to this software that the Artemis will be usable by any country that's allied with Ukraine and the US, as Auterion CEO Lorenz Meyer points out. Software-driven autonomy is changing the nature of deterrence, Meyer says. Our Artemis entrant is designed for mass production and rapid deployment, enabling partner nations to field resilient autonomous strike capabilities at scale. Don't underestimate the importance of this software. A long-range UAV that can resist Russia's jamming is an extremely dangerous prospect for Putin. As Politico points out, Russia has been using GPS jamming at an increasing rate over the course of the Ukraine war. Often, this technology is used for hybrid warfare purposes, such as Russia's constant attacks on shipping and aircraft flying in NATO airspace. However, Russia has also installed GPS jammers in many of the facilities that it wants to protect from Ukraine's long-range drones. The idea is simple. Most drones use GPS to find their targets. When that GPS is jammed, the drone can't figure out where it's going and it flies off course. Artemis appears to have mitigated this problem for Ukraine. And when the US starts using the drone, it'll also know that it has a weapon that Russia can't jam. Now, there's an unexpected addendum to the GPS jamming issue. Ukraine, of course, uses similar jamming techniques to Russia in an effort to stop Russia's Shahed-type drones from scoring hits on their targets. As Business Insider revealed on October 16, this means that Ukraine's skies are becoming so crowded with its own GPS jammers that it can make it difficult for the country to work out how to launch its drones into Russian territory. As a pilot named Dmytro Zluktenko, who served with Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, told Business Insider, "We have to coordinate, saying when we're going to fly through the front line." There are a couple of interesting issues that arise here. When Ukraine shuts down its GPS jamming to send out its own drones, avenues for attack open up to Russia. Russia may never be able to time its long-range drone strikes to take advantage of these avenues, but there's always a chance of Russian drones arriving at the same time as Ukrainian drones leave, meaning Ukraine's jammers would be out of commission. The other problem, of course, is that active jamming means that Ukraine is limited in terms of where it can launch its drones. Both problems could be solved by Artemis, which appears to be just as capable of overcoming Ukraine's GPS jamming as it is of overcoming Russia's electronic warfare techniques. Skynode N will be huge for the Artemis drone. And who knows, it may be the sort of thing that Ukraine will be able to build into its own drones, which in turn could benefit the US. Artemis may end up being the trailblazer that enables Ukraine to build drones domestically that meet US requirements. Each country strengthens the other, all thanks to the software used by this initial drone. Now, Russia's Shahed types were mentioned a moment ago. As Defense Express notes in its report on the Artemis, Auterion has published a single image of its new drone that reveals it shares more than a few design similarities with the Shahed. The shape, in particular, makes it look a little like a Shahed 136. However, that shouldn't come as a surprise. The Shahed itself is based on the German DAR, the outlet says, and that's several decades old. This is a tried and tested design. However, the combined forces of Auterion and its Ukrainian partners have done far more than copy somebody else's homework. They tweaked the design so that it's better than ever. The Artemis has a nose-mounted camera, Defense Express reports, which will presumably send a real-time video feed to the Skynode N mission computer used to operate the drone. Perhaps this camera might even allow Artemis to serve as a long-range reconnaissance drone that gathers intelligence on prospective targets inside Russia. The drone also has additional antennas. Typically, these antennas allow a drone to communicate with its operator and vice versa, so it looks like Artemis may have a couple of backup antennas where Shahed doesn't. Finally, Defense Express says, the Artemis drone also uses an electric motor, which is uncommon in long-range drones. Auterion and its Ukrainian partners may have developed this engine so that Artemis is quieter than other long-range drones. So, Artemis is familiar, yet different. And that's not a bad thing. Familiarity allows for a drone to be more easily integrated into a country's arsenal. Here, Ukraine's influence on the design process may be apparent. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the US drew from Ukraine's first-hand experience to develop Artemis. The final product seems to be a far more advanced Shahed equivalent that has some autonomous capabilities and is resistant to electronic warfare, Euromaidan press reports. Ukraine will be happy with that. The US will be delighted that it now has a long-range drone it can develop in-house that it knows it's going to be combat tested in Ukraine. The next step is scaling up toward mass-scale co-production of the drone, and Auterion seems to have that well in hand. Euromaidan press says that the company is already building several manufacturing lines in Ukraine, the US, and interestingly, Germany. Perhaps that's a hint that the Artemis will soon find its way into the arsenals of NATO's European members too. Having manufacturing lines outside Ukraine also means that Russia won't be able to stop the building of Artemis drones, even if it manages to discover and strike the Ukrainian manufacturer that's worked on the drone. Unless Russia wants to start a war with the US or Germany, it'll be forced to accept that both countries can provide this new drone to Ukraine if Ukraine can't build the drone itself. So it looks like all of the bases are covered. Artemis is here, and it's going to be unleashed en masse once production is put into place. So what does the development of this drone mean for the future? For Ukraine, the successful development of Artemis is a perfect example of the joint drone production operations that it's trying to start with as many external contractors as possible, Euromaidan press reports. This is a smart move by Ukraine. The country is using these joint development programs to further strengthen its ties to its Western allies, all while using itself as the testing ground for the products that come out of these relationships. Mikhailo Fedorov, who is Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for Innovation, Education, Science and Tech, and Minister of Digital Transformation, explained the country's approach during an appearance at September's Defense Tech Valley Expo. "This is the innovation cycle, and here we're moving quite fast," Fedorov said. "We sent a message to our partners who arrived today. If your products are not being tested in Ukraine today, then you will not be able to stay competitive in the defense market." The US has clearly heard that message. Several other nations have too. On October 15, the UK announced that it has shipped 85,000 drones to Ukraine, and it's invested around $730 to $760 million in 2025 to help Ukraine boost the production of drones domestically. The UK and Ukraine have also signed a technology sharing deal that will benefit the development of a new interceptor drone Ukraine can use to fend off Russia's long-range UAVs. Of course, the UK will also be able to build this drone when it's ready, meaning it can add the new UAV to its own stockpiles. The UK also worked alongside Latvia to create the International Drone Coalition with Ukraine. That coalition exists to help Ukraine develop and test new drones, all of which will likely also end up being used by the members of the coalition. On July 3rd, United 24 Media reported that this coalition now has 20 members, with Turkey and Belgium being the newest. What's being seen here is an attempt to standardize drone technology across NATO. Yes, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, at least not yet, but pretty much every nation with which it works on these types of joint drone products is a NATO ally, and that means very bad things for Putin. Russia's leader appears to be thinking about a war with NATO should he succeed in Ukraine. Before these joint developments started to crop up, most of Ukraine's drones were being developed domestically with no real standardization. Now, it looks like a veritable arsenal of drones, each with its own purpose, is being built both for use in Ukraine right now and use by NATO in the future. The Artemis is just the latest in an increasingly long line. Soon, drones will be built to a defined NATO standard, much like many of the other weapons that the Defense Collective uses. The creation of Artemis also signals the further strengthening of the relationship between Ukraine and Auterion. The Artemis drone isn't the first time the two have worked together. Back in July, Auterion signed a contract with Ukraine to deliver 33,000 of its Sky-Node strike kits. That deal was worth $50 million. It also has the Pentagon's backing, which feeds into the point made earlier about Ukraine's increasing cooperation with the US defense industry. The earlier mention of how Ukraine might be able to incorporate the Sky-Node system used in the Artemis drone into its other drones is reinforced by the purchase of these kits, which seems to highlight it's doing just that. And then there's the US. As important as the development of the Artemis may prove to be for Ukraine, it will be just as important for the US. See, the US has a problem with its military. For as advanced as most of its hardware is, the US is a long way behind many other nations when it comes to drone development. Before the Ukraine war, that wasn't a problem. Drones were seen as useful, though not war-changing pieces of equipment. But Ukraine changed the face of the war with its use of drones, proving that they're essential when fighting against a country like Russia that uses ground-based attritional tactics. The US faced a dilemma. It had spent the previous decades pumping trillions of dollars into the next generations of aerial platforms, air defenses, and the like, but had severely underinvested in the one weapon that seemed to be proving the most useful in a war against Russia. CNN highlighted this issue in a September 15 article. Most American soldiers lack the know-how for fighting with unmanned systems, and while the US has excelled at building large, expensive weaponry, fighter jets, tanks, precision-guided missiles, it's in many ways unprepared to quickly produce large quantities of small, cheap systems like drones, the outlet said. And CNN isn't the only outlet pointing this out. On October 14, the War Zone reported that Lieutenant General Charles Costanza, who commands the V Corps, had made it clear that the US had a lot of catching up to do. "We're behind. I'll just be candid. I think we know we're behind," Costanza said during the Association of the US Army's annual symposium. "We've been talking about the counter-UAS, uncrewed aerial systems, and UAS capability for a better part of a decade, since really we watched the war in Armenia and Azerbaijan go on, and saw very much the beginning of the drone UAS capabilities. Watching and talking aren't the same thing as building and using. Ukraine has spent the better part of 4 years doing the latter two things. The US has been focused too much on the former two. Now, the time for watching and talking is over, because America is dealing with a problem today that it never thought it would face. The country's defense contractors are starting to play catch-up. Requests are being lodged in the thousands for Ukrainian drone data, especially footage showcasing successful strikes, CNN reports Fedorov is stating. Ukraine has a chance to leverage its drone innovation to ingratiate itself further with its Western partners, and it's taking advantage of that fact. The US, on the other hand, is approving the types of contracts that Altarian is signing with Ukraine because it knows that, for once, another country is ahead of it when it comes to military technology. As US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth puts it, "Lethality will not be hindered by self-imposed restrictions, especially when it comes to harnessing technologies we invented but were slow to pursue," Hegseth says. "Drone technology is advancing so rapidly, our major risk is risk avoidance." Hegseth also says that he expects drone capabilities to be baked into the US military by 2026, which includes the development of the capability to conduct force-on-force drone wars. The Artemis drone could help the US develop that capability. And that drone would have been possible were it not for Ukraine cooperating with a US manufacturer to make that drone a reality. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has spent 25 years in power. He's ruled Russia with an iron fist, clinging to the presidency year after year, using every trick in the book to remain in charge. Desperate to go down in history as his nation's greatest ever leader, he's painted himself as a defender of traditional values, a guardian of sovereignty, and the only man capable of leading such a vast and influential country as Russia to glory and prosperity. But everything comes to an end eventually, and Putin's control of Russia is well and truly starting to slip, reaching such a low point that even the Kremlin can no longer cover it up. The worst part of it all, from Putin's perspective, is that this was all his own doing. The president, who recently celebrated his 73rd birthday, could have continued leading Russia for many more years to come, perhaps all the way into his 80s and even beyond. All he had to do, essentially, was exactly what he'd been doing his entire political career, following the same proven playbook that had kept him relatively popular with the people of Russia and supremely powerful on the world stage. Instead, he now finds himself stuck in a hole so deep, no amount of lies and bluster will be enough to dig his way out, and it's entirely his own fault. It's the end result of his own reckless decisions, excessive hubris, and one massive misjudgment, and it all goes back to the early stages of 2022, when the Russian president gave the order that would change the modern world forevermore. Seeking to expand his sphere of power and influence even further, Putin made the call to invade Ukraine, ordering his army over the border and onto the territory of its neighbor. At the time, he justified his decision with baseless claims that so-called Nazis had taken over Ukraine, and it was up to Russia to ride in and save the day. In reality, the world at large saw this move for exactly what it was, just another manifestation of Putin's unquenchable lust for power. He wanted more land, more resources, more influence, and he was willing to do whatever it took to acquire it. But then came his one massive misjudgment. He thought it would be easy. Given the enormity of his army, the vast quantities of tanks, armored vehicles, missiles and more that Russia had in its own arsenal, and the sheer disparity between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military, Putin assumed that Russian troops would roll right through whatever feeble defenses Ukraine might mount, marching all the way to Kyiv and raising the Russian flag of victory in a matter of days, or a few weeks at the most. As is now well known, that's not what happened. Ukraine proved a significantly tougher nut to crack than Putin could ever have anticipated. Its people rose up and stood firm, defending their land with heroism and pride. Up and down the country, not just trained soldiers but simple civilians took up arms and stood their ground against the hordes of Russian troops heading their way. As a whole, the country of Ukraine showed that it would not go down without a fight. and any hope Putin and his fellow Kremlin cronies had of a swift and crushing victory went up in smoke. And even though Russia made some headway in the early days and weeks, the army's progress soon started to stall. Then, as more time passed, Ukraine began to push the Russians back, reclaiming lost land and even crossing over the border and into Russia at certain stages, taking territory away from Putin, humiliating him on his own turf. Gradually getting stronger and more strategic, to the point where it's now rightfully regarded as one of the world's most capable military powers, Ukraine then went further, launching deep strikes, missiles and drone attacks on high-value Russian assets. The effects of these attacks are clear to see. Russia currently sits in a state of economic disarray and faces an unprecedented fuel crisis that shows no signs of easing anytime soon. Its oil production capacities have been slashed. Its people are paying up to twice the price for fuel and other goods than they did only a year ago. And with Ukraine's drones and missiles growing stronger and more capable than ever, no Russian region truly feels safe anymore. The war has come home to Russia in ways that the Kremlin could never have imagined, even in its worst-case scenario contingency plans. The country has also suffered unimaginable losses, recently reaching the grim milestone of more than 1.1 million casualties, with a recent report from the British Ministry of Defence revealing there have been around 332,000 dead and wounded Russian troops in 2025 alone, while the Ukrainian General Staff reports an average of 950 additional Russian casualties with every passing day. On top of all of this, Russia has slowly but surely been cut off from large parts of the rest of the world. Western nations across Europe and North America imposed an array of financial sanctions, weakening the Kremlin's economy, while many countries also cut ties with Russian banks and businesses, further isolating the nation, its people, and its leadership. Every single one of these catastrophic consequences is the direct result of Vladimir Putin's arrogance. He wanted more power and thought he could simply steal entire regions of Ukraine to get it. Perhaps a lifetime of always getting what he wants blinded him to the recklessness of this decision, but even he can most certainly see what a disaster it's turned into by now. And so can the Russian people, many of whom are starting to grow increasingly tired of this war and resentful of Putin for persisting with it. Indeed, a recent poll of the Russian people, carried out by the Levada Center, revealed that around 2/3 or 66% of Russians would prefer to see negotiations take place rather than continued fighting. The percentage is even higher among certain groups, with 74% of women and 80% of young people under 24 years of age preferring to see peace talks, with just 27% of all Russians polled believing that continued military action is still the right path at this stage. The poll also revealed that more and more Russians are feeling personally impacted by the war, with 58% saying that the so-called special military operation has affected their lives or their family lives in one way or another, and more than 1 in 5, 22%, saying they've been greatly affected by it. Some cited the fact that they had lost loved ones in the conflict, for example, or seen people close to them injured. Others spoke of how their financial situation had worsened since the war began, and some said that the situation had led to the destruction of family ties, as well as causing significant mental and emotional distress. Even at the highest levels, various Russian elites, oligarchs, generals, and other people in positions of power are said to be expressing emotions of fatigue, frustration, and disappointment with how the war has gone and how it continues to be managed by President Putin. The more those levels of resentment and frustration rise, the worse Putin's situation will become. That's why he's gone to such great lengths to control the narrative within Russia's borders, controlling and restricting access to certain news websites and social media platforms to prevent the Russian people from learning the truth, telling them time and time again his grand speeches that the war is necessary, that all those who died have done so for a noble cause, and that Russia is on track for victory. But he can't cover up the fact that the war has gone on far longer than he or almost anyone else expected, and that it continues to burden the Russian population and drain the nation's economy. And the more time passes, the more easily people see through his lies and propaganda. Only a few months ago, for example, at the start of summer, Russia put plans in place for its grand summer offensive. This was supposed to be the offensive to end them all, the last big push of the Russian army onward into Donetsk, leading to a complete takeover of the region at long last. That's how captured Russian officers described it to Ukrainians, and it's clear that Russia wanted to make major headway through the summer months while the weather conditions were warm and agreeable. They threw everything they had at key frontline territories, from tanks to artillery, drones, and vast squadrons of freshly recruited troops. Putin, meanwhile, made bold, brash proclamations about all of Ukraine belonging to Russia, setting the scene for complete conquest of the country. Pro-Kremlin propaganda outlets too, like Pravda, have been making big claims that Russia is well on the way towards breaking through Ukraine's final defensive lines before the end of the year. In reality, however, despite some ground gained here and there, Putin's grand summer offensive largely fell flat. It went the exact same way as every other Russian offensive so far in the war, ending up with both Ukraine and Russia in more or less the same place they started, give or take small slivers of land in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The most important locations, like the strategic industrial hub of Pokrovsk, still elude Russia's forces, and Ukraine's famous fortress belt, which stretches through western Donetsk and incorporates important cities like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, also remains in Ukraine's control. Analysts expect it would take Russia several more years to even complete its initial objective of capturing the Donbas region, let alone the decades of additional fighting that would be needed for full conquest of Ukraine. In the meantime, Russia's losses continue to rise, and every time Putin or the Kremlin promise that victory is within reach, but fall through on that promise, trust and belief in that Putin regime slowly but surely erodes. Now, it's eroded so much that there's barely any belief left at all, and history is about to repeat itself, as Russia once more builds up to another big offensive in the Donbas. But this might well be Putin's last roll of the dice. Within Russia, opposition politicians now say that if this renewed offensive fails, as all the others have before it, Putin may have no other option but to either end the war or at the very least call for a ceasefire before the end of the year. In short, the coming weeks and months are set to be a pivotal moment, with massive influence on the rest of the war and its potential outcome, one way or another. As such, Putin will be banking on his troops somehow finding a way through Ukraine's defenses, as detailed in a report from the RE Russia media platform and think tank, which writes, "For 8 months this year, the Russian army has failed to achieve any decisive changes on the battlefield. The attempt at a decisive breakthrough over the next 2 months, for which Russia has built up a significant manpower reserve, represents an opportunity to alter the outcome and what's been an extremely costly and low-yield offensive lasting 2 years. Should it succeed, Ukrainian forces will, in all likelihood, be forced to abandon the Donbas. Should it fail, Russia's efforts to bring the region fully under its control can be deemed a failure. Thus, the next 2 months will mark the climax of the Battle of the Donbas, Russia's uninterrupted 2-year offensive, and possibly the climax of the entire 4-year war, setting the course of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict for a long time to come." The RE Russia report also details just how wasteful and costly the war has become, noting, "Over the course of 20 months, Russia has captured only about 6,200 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, securing control of just over half of the part of the region that had remained outside its control. During this time, Russian military losses in killed and wounded have amounted to around 700,000, that is 110 men per square kilometer or 1,200 per day, double the losses sustained in 2022 to 2023. The writers add that the offensive is still only made possible by the Kremlin's reckless and desperate spending, offering increasingly high bonuses and incentives to encourage able-bodied men across Russia to sign up and join the fight. Thanks to this, the Kremlin is still able to add tens of thousands of troops to its ranks each month, replacing those that are killed or injured and continuing to pile pressure on Ukraine's defensive lines. This will give Putin at least some level of optimism that his forces might finally do what they've been unable to do for so long, and the fact that Ukraine is struggling with a manpower crisis will also provide some degree of encouragement to the Russians. But while it may have a couple of factors in its favor, the Kremlin's war machine still has a veritable mountain to climb if it wants to emerge victorious. Ukraine may not be able to rival Russia's manpower, it never has, nor can it muster the same colossal quantities of military spending and military hardware. However, as seen in over 3 years of war so far, none of that matters as much as it may seem. Because despite being a significantly smaller and weaker force on paper, Ukraine has consistently and continuously defied the odds, fended off Russia's attacks and held its ground. And even now, with troop numbers running low in certain areas, Ukraine is showing that same strength, strategy and adaptability that got it this far. It's adjusting its tactics, digging in and defending the areas that matter most, launching devastating attacks on Russian infrastructure and using the resources at its disposal to best effect. it also continues to receive enormous support from allies around the world, like the United States and other members of the NATO alliance. Thanks to that, any Russian belief in some big breakthrough on the horizon may once more prove to be misplaced. And if Russia fails yet again, the level of support for this war, and for Putin, is only going to drop further, eventually reaching a point where the Kremlin head may find he no longer has the freedom and options he once did. Because in his own ideal world, Putin would love to keep this war going as long as it takes to claim a grand and decisive victory. He still likes to describe the conflict as a special military operation in his speeches and statements, because it paints a picture to the masses of a controlled conflict, one in which a distant, expeditionary force is doing battle with some evil enemy in Ukraine without really impacting the economy or everyday lives of the Russian people in any notable way. That's exactly how Putin wants it to be and what he's tried so hard to achieve. But with Ukraine effectively bringing the conflict home to Russians in more ways than one, Putin can no longer pretend that this is anything less than a full-scale war, one in which his country has suffered and continues to suffer the kind of losses it hasn't seen since the Second World War. So, as the special operation narrative has lost all credence, Putin only has a couple of options remaining should his forces fail to take Donbass. One option is to suspend the war, temporarily, before restarting it later on. But this approach is fraught with danger, as Putin will not only have to contend with internal political and economic problems during the downtime, but also find a way to once again build support and construct some sort of feasible reason to restart the conflict. His other choice, and perhaps the only vaguely viable one left over, is to actually agree a peace deal with Ukraine, ideally one that would involve favourable terms for Russia, so that Putin can sell it as some sort of victory. Putin would essentially reserve the right to recommence the invasion at a later date, when the time is right, and he could easily place the blame on Ukraine, claiming it violated the peace agreement or coming up with some other similar excuse to send his army back over the border. However, even this scenario may be much more difficult to accomplish than Putin hopes, because Russia is not in the powerful position it once was. It's not winning this war, it's not dominating its opponent, gaining ground at rapid rates, and marching towards some sort of crushing victory. It is instead struggling to build any sort of momentum, all while suffering increasingly dramatic and devastating losses. As such, the Kremlin cannot simply take a seat at the negotiating table and dictate terms, expecting the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky to meekly obey its demands. Yet again, this is all the result of Putin's bad decision making, because he did have a chance to potentially get a deal that would have worked for Russia earlier this year, when US President Donald Trump spoke with leaders of both countries in a bid to broker a ceasefire. At the time, Trump was relatively lenient with Putin, preferring instead to put pressure on Zelensky to agree to a deal. The Russian leader could and perhaps should have seized that chance to end the conflict before it got any worse. Instead, he made the wrong choice yet again. And now he's paying the price, because President Trump's patience was pushed too far. Trump has openly admitted to being angry and tired of Putin's lies and mind games, and only recently posted online that he believes Ukraine has the power to go on and win the war, reclaiming every piece of territory taken by Russia. The Trump administration has also offered additional aid to Ukraine, including American intelligence to assist Ukrainian drone strikes, and even the possibility of long-range Tomahawk missiles too. So, not only are the realities of the war clearer to see for all in Russia and beyond, but Russia's chances of making major breakthroughs or pushing towards victory are growing slimmer by the day. Casualties are rising, losses are mounting, crises are multiplying, and the economy is spiraling. And in such a dire, desperate state, even Vladimir Putin, that old master of clinging to power and twisting any situation to his advantage, is rapidly running out of options and ideas. Now, learn more about the pressure piling up on Putin in this video, showing how hundreds of ordinary Russian citizens recently defied state censorship to protest the war in St. Petersburg. Or, for an in-depth look at how woeful the war has become for Russia, check out this video detailing the country's catastrophic losses that even the Kremlin's propaganda cannot cover up. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our channel too, if you haven't already, so you can stay informed and aware of all major news and developments from the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts across the globe.